Dawn breaks cold over the Bavarian countryside on June 30th, 1934. At the Hotel Hanselbauer, 30 miles south of Munich, a peculiar silence hangs in the morning air, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Within hours, this lakeside retreat will become a slaughterhouse, the site where old comrades will turn executioner, where loyalty will prove as fragile as morning mist over the Tegernsee. The man sleeping upstairs, Ernst Röhm, has no idea that his oldest friend has already signed his death warrant. By this time tomorrow, the most powerful paramilitary commander in Germany will be dead, executed in a Munich prison, his blood marking the final act of what history will remember as the Night of the Long Knives. But to understand how this decorated war hero became the target of his own regime's murderous purge, we must travel back 4 decades to a Germany that no longer exists. Ernst Julius Günther Röhm entered the world on November 28, 1887, in the small Bavarian town of Ingolstadt, nestled in the heartland of what was then the German Empire. His father, Guido Julius Joseph Röhm, worked as a railway administrator, a government position that afforded the family a comfortable, if unremarkable, middle-class existence. The Germany into which young Ernst was born stood at the zenith of its imperial ambitions, a newly unified nation eager to assert itself among the great powers of Europe. The Röhm household was, by all accounts, a study in contrasts. Guido Röhm ruled with the stern hand of a Prussian disciplinarian, a man shaped by rigid hierarchies and absolute obedience. Ernst found little warmth in his relationship with his father, their interactions marked by tension and misunderstanding. Yet what the boy lacked in paternal affection, he found abundantly in his mother, Sophia Emily Röhm, whom he would later describe with uncharacteristic sentimentness as the finest wife and mother anyone could hope for. She doted on Ernst above all others, creating a bond that would endure throughout his life. The family included 2 other children, an older sister, Emily, and an older brother, Julius. Ernst formed a particularly close attachment to Emily, a relationship that survived even after her marriage took her to Austria. With Julius, however, the relationship remained distant, colored perhaps by the competitive dynamics common among brothers in that era. Young Ernst grew up during a period of profound transformation in Germany. The nation that had been a patchwork of independent kingdoms and duchies just 16 years before his birth had been forged into a unified empire under Prussian leadership. This unification, orchestrated by the legendary statesman Otto von Bismarck, had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. The German Empire now stood as an economic and military colossus, hungry to prove itself on the world stage. This atmosphere of nationalist fervor and imperial ambition would profoundly shape Röhm's worldview. The Germany of his youth was a society that celebrated military prowess, valued hierarchical order, and embraced a mythology of Germanic superiority that would later find its most toxic expression in Nazi ideology. Ernst Röhm attended the prestigious Royal Maximilian High School, an institution designed to produce the empire's future civil servants and military officers. Yet the young man showed little aptitude for or interest in academic pursuits. The classroom bored him. The abstract world of books and theories seemed bloodless compared to the martial values he absorbed from the culture around him. While other students buried themselves in Latin declensions and mathematical proofs, Röhm dreamed of uniforms and parade grounds, of the camaraderie of the barracks and the glory of the battlefield. At 17, Röhm made the decision that would define his entire life. He would become a soldier. On July 23, 1906, he enlisted as a cadet in the Royal Bavarian 10th Infantry Regiment, known as the Prince Ludwig Regiment, stationed in the garrison town of Ingolstadt, his birthplace. Here, Röhm found his true calling. The military structure, with its clear hierarchies and unambiguous expectations, suited his temperament perfectly. Where academic study had left him cold, the disciplined world of military training ignited something fundamental in his character. His superiors quickly recognized his dedication and potential. Less than 2 years after joining as a cadet on March 12, 1908, Röhm received his commission as an officer. At just 20 years old, he had achieved what many spent decades pursuing. The young officer threw himself into his duties with characteristic intensity, earning a reputation for thoroughness and an almost fanatical attention to military detail. For the next 6 years, Röhm served during peacetime, a period that might have consigned him to obscurity had history not taken a catastrophic turn. But in the summer of 1914, the intricate system of alliances that bound Europe's great powers together began to unravel with terrifying speed. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set in motion a diplomatic crisis that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Within weeks, the great powers of Europe found themselves mobilizing for war. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia and France. When German forces violated Belgian neutrality to attack France, Britain entered the conflict. By August, the continent was engulfed in a conflagration that would ultimately consume millions of lives. For Ernst Röhm, the outbreak of war transformed abstract military training into immediate, brutal reality. He was appointed adjutant to the 1st Battalion of his regiment, and his unit received orders to deploy to the border region near Metz, in what was then German Lorraine. Their mission: defend the critical rail lines and borders as Germany launched its ambitious offensive into France. Röhm experienced his baptism of fire on August 25, 1914 at Flamval. The engagement shattered any romantic notions he might have harbored about warfare's glory. The reality proved far more savage than parade ground exercises had suggested. By September 10th, barely 2 weeks into sustained combat, only 8 officers in his battalion remained fit for duty. The casualties sustained near Gerlancourt had been catastrophic, a harbinger of the industrial scale slaughter that would characterize the entire conflict. It was during fighting in the Spada region of Lorraine that Röhm received his first serious wound, one that would mark him for life. A shell fragment struck him in the face, shattering the bridge of his nose. The injury left him permanently disfigured, creating a distinctive scar that became one of his most recognizable features. It was the first of more than a dozen wounds Röhm would sustain during 4 years of warfare, each one a testament to his reckless courage and seeming indifference to personal danger. After recovering from his facial wound, Röhm returned to duty with a promotion to first lieutenant, Oberleutnant in German military parlance. The army recognized not merely his survival but his exceptional performance under fire. He was given command of the 10th Company at Ailette Wood, a position of considerable responsibility for an officer still in his 20s. The next several years saw Röhm deployed across the Western Front, that nightmarish landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and no man's land that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. He saw action in some of the war's most brutal engagements, including the apocalyptic Battle of Verdun in 1916, a 10-month struggle that would claim over 700,000 casualties on both sides. In June of 1916, Röhm's company achieved a notable success when they became the first unit to storm the French trenches and capture the redoubt at Thiaumont. This achievement came at enormous cost, but it demonstrated the aggressive leadership style that would become Röhm's trademark. He led from the front, seemingly indifferent to danger, inspiring his men through personal example rather than merely barking orders from behind the lines. His reckless bravery nearly cost him his life when a bullet passed perilously close to his lung before exiting through his shoulder. The wound should have killed him. Instead, it earned him the Iron Cross First Class, Germany's highest military honor for junior officers. The citation praised his outstanding devotion to duty and bravery on all occasions since the beginning of the war. These were not empty words. Röhm's fellow officers consistently remarked on his almost suicidal disregard for personal safety. Where others sought cover, Röhm exposed himself to enemy fire. Where others hung back, he charged forward. This combination of courage and recklessness earned him the respect of his men and the attention of his superiors. Röhm's battlefield prowess eventually led to his transfer to staff positions, where his organizational abilities could be employed more broadly. Following his recovery from the lung wound, he was accepted into the War Ministry under Colonel Koller, where he served as adjutant to the head of the Army Department. This marked a significant shift in his career trajectory from combat officer to military administrator. By April 1917, Röhm had been promoted to captain, Hauptmann, a rank that carried substantial authority and responsibility. Shortly thereafter, he received orders deploying him to Romania, where he would serve as adjutant to the divisional staff overseeing the 26th, 27th and 28th Infantry Regiments, along with the 22nd Artillery Regiment. This assignment placed him at the operational level of military planning, coordinating the activities of multiple regiments, a role requiring both tactical acumen and administrative competence. Romania's involvement in the war had been brief but consequential. The country had entered the conflict on the Allied side in August 1916, hoping to seize Transylvania from Austria-Hungary. Instead, German and Austrian forces invaded Romania, occupied Bucharest, and forced the Romanian government to sue for peace. By late 1917, Russia, torn apart by revolution, and Romania negotiated an armistice with the Central Powers, effectively removing the Eastern Front as an active theatre of operations. This development meant that German divisions stationed in Romania, including Röhm's, could be redeployed to the Western Front, where the war's outcome would ultimately be decided. Röhm left Romania on April 17, 1918, and returned to France, where he continued serving on divisional staff until October 2nd. At that point, he transferred to the Guard Corps staff, where a crisis presented him with an unexpected opportunity. The autumn of 1918 brought not only military defeat, but also biological catastrophe. The Spanish influenza pandemic swept through the armies of both sides with devastating force, killing soldiers who had survived years of combat. As officers throughout Röhm's division fell ill, he was promoted to 3rd General Staff Officer, a position of significant responsibility that placed him in charge of consolidating and evaluating all frontline reports for his division. In this role, Röhm controlled reconnaissance operations, both aerial and ground-based, giving him comprehensive oversight of intelligence gathering. It was the kind of position that revealed a young officer's potential for higher command. But just as Röhm was demonstrating his administrative capabilities, the influenza struck him down as well. On October 21, 1918, Röhm was admitted to a field hospital, his condition serious enough to warrant immediate evacuation. He was transferred to a facility in Halle, near Brussels, where the divisional doctor grimly concluded that Röhm might not survive. The physician recommended finding a replacement, convinced that the young captain would succumb to the virus that was killing millions across Europe. Yet Röhm's constitution proved as tough as his battlefield courage. After a lengthy convalescence that pushed him to the brink of death, he recovered and returned to his post at Saint-Sever on November 3, 1918. He arrived to discover that during his absence, his position had indeed been filled by another officer. The disappointment must have been acute, to survive both combat wounds and a deadly pandemic, only to find oneself replaced. But these personal setbacks paled in comparison to the historic catastrophe unfolding around him. Just 8 days after Röhm returned to duty, on November 11, 1918, the Great War came to an end. Germany, after 4 years of unprecedented sacrifice, had been defeated. The empire was collapsing, revolution was spreading through the cities, and the world Röhm had known was disintegrating. Still weakened from his second bout of Spanish influenza, Röhm travelled back to Munich in late November 1918. He arrived to find his homeland transformed beyond recognition. Bavaria's capital had become the epicenter of revolutionary upheaval. Just weeks earlier, on November 7th, even before the armistice was signed, socialist Kurt Eisner had proclaimed the Bavarian Soviet Republic, deposing the Wittelsbach monarchy that had ruled Bavaria for over 7 centuries. The scene that greeted Röhm captured the humiliation of Germany's defeat. As he made his way through Munich's streets, still wearing his officer's uniform, his sergeant approached him discreetly and offered whispered advice. "Remove the black, white and red cockade of Imperial Germany from your cap." "That is how far things have gotten here," the sergeant muttered, his words heavy with disgust. For Röhm, a man who had spent 4 years fighting for that empire, who bore the scars of a dozen wounds on its behalf, this moment crystallized everything that had gone wrong. The revolutionaries who now controlled Bavaria had never faced enemy fire, had never stormed enemy trenches, had never seen their comrades torn apart by artillery shells. Yet they now presumed to rule over men like him. Röhm sought out Lieutenant Colonel von Sonnenberg, hoping to understand how the Bavarian army, surely still loyal to traditional authority, had allowed this revolutionary travesty to occur. The colonel's response left him stunned. "The revolt took us by surprise," von Sonnenberg explained with evident discomfort. "We must allow it to develop quietly and run its course." This passive acceptance enraged Röhm. In his view, the military leadership had betrayed everything the army supposedly stood for. They had shown their cowardice, lack of resolve, and inability to act, hastening to comply with trembling civilian bureaucracy rather than defending the Kaiser and king. The commanders had surrendered to what Röhm contemptuously called the mutinous mob without firing a shot, hiding from their responsibilities at the very moment when decisive action might have preserved the old order. Disgusted and disillusioned, Röhm made a fateful decision. He would leave Bavaria and join the Freikorps, the Free Corps, right-wing paramilitary organizations of former soldiers who refused to accept the new revolutionary government. These private armies, operating in a legal grey zone, attracted veterans who felt betrayed by both the military leadership and the new civilian authorities. In February 1919, Röhm departed Bavaria to join the Freikorps units being assembled elsewhere in Germany. The journey itself proved hazardous, illustrating the chaos that gripped the country. Near Dachau, Röhm's train was halted abruptly. Kurt Eisner, the leader of Bavaria's revolutionary government, had just been assassinated in Munich by a right-wing nationalist who called Eisner a Bolshevist and a Jew, not a real German. This assassination set off a wave of retaliatory violence. Revolutionary forces were arresting anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary sympathies, and trains were being stopped and searched. Many potential Freikorps recruits like Röhm were being detained before they could reach the paramilitary assembly points. Röhm considered himself fortunate to escape arrest and make it to Ohrdruf, where Freikorps units were gathering. Upon arriving at the Freikorps assembly point in Ohrdruf, Röhm reported to the unit's general staff, where he was assigned to serve under Colonel Franz Ritter von Epp, a decorated officer who would become one of the most significant figures in Röhm's early political development. Von Epp commanded one of several Freikorps units being mobilized to crush the various socialist and communist governments that had seized power across Germany in the chaotic months following the armistice. Röhm's new assignment initially seemed mundane. He was placed in charge of logistics, specifically managing catering and supplies for von Epp's Freikorps brigade. Yet this administrative role would prove crucial, both for the immediate military campaign and for Röhm's future career. When he first assumed the position, the Freikorps suffered from chronic supply problems, weapons shortages, inadequate provisions, and transportation bottlenecks that threatened to undermine the entire operation. Röhm attacked these logistical challenges with the same ferocious energy he had displayed on the battlefield. Within weeks, trains laden with weapons, equipment, and horses began arriving regularly at the Freikorps camps. Röhm accomplished this through methods that operated in legal grey zones. He illegally requisitioned military supplies from stockpiles that had been earmarked for destruction under the Treaty of Versailles, redirected weapons caches that were supposed to be surrendered to Allied inspectors, and employed his network of sympathetic officers still serving in the official army to divert resources to the Freikorps. The logistics company assigned to handle incoming supplies soon found itself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material Röhm managed to procure. His organizational abilities, combined with a complete disregard for legal niceties when they interfered with his objectives, made him indispensable to the Freikorps operation. April 14, 1919. The political situation in Bavaria had deteriorated to the point where the official German government decided to act decisively. The Bavarian Soviet Republic in Munich had fractured internally, with moderate socialists breaking away to form the People's State of Bavaria, based in the city of Bamberg. This split created an opportunity for the Freikorps to strike. On April 22nd, the first Freikorps transports departed from Ohrdruf, heading south toward Bavaria. Many more would follow in the coming days. The Freikorps forces traveled via Stuttgart to Ulm on Bavaria's western border, positioning themselves for an assault on the communist stronghold of Munich. Just 2 days later, on April 24th, Röhm's unit marched into Ingolstadt, his birthplace, after brief skirmishes with Spartacist defenders. The Bavarian Freikorps did not fight alone. Units from Landsberg and Swabia joined the campaign, along with a small detachment of official German military forces. Together, these right-wing forces surrounded Munich. Although coordination among the various units broke down repeatedly, each commander jealous of his authority and unwilling to subordinate himself to others, the sheer numerical superiority of the Freikorps forces proved decisive. On May 2, 1919, Munich fell to von Epp's forces, and the Bavarian Soviet Republic collapsed. Röhm had never considered himself a particularly political creature. He was a soldier, trained to follow orders and execute missions. Yet he was perceptive enough to recognize that the events of 1918 and 1919 had fundamentally altered the relationship between military and political authority in Germany. As he would later write, the old imperial regime had actively discouraged military officers from involving themselves in politics, treating such engagement as unseemly and outside an officer's proper sphere of responsibility. This attitude struck Röhm as dangerously naive in the new Germany. He noted with bitter irony that 94% of active officers had been either killed or wounded during the war, casualties of political decisions made by civilian leaders who sent them into that inferno. How could the officer corps remain apolitical when politicians now exercised direct control over the military's existence and mission? An officer might remain politically neutral when serving as a mercenary in a foreign land, Röhm reasoned, but not in his own country, not when politicians and parliamentarians now wielded unprecedented influence over military matters. In his view, the army represented the supreme instrument of German nationalism, far superior to the squabbling politicians who had surrendered Germany's honor at Versailles. This conviction would shape everything Röhm did in the years ahead. He did not simply want to restore German military power. He envisioned a political system where military values, discipline, hierarchy, sacrifice, unity would displace what he saw as the weakness and corruption of parliamentary democracy. On February 24, 1920, a mass meeting took place at Munich's Hofbräuhaus Beer Hall that would prove historically consequential. The German Workers' Party, a small nationalist organization, presented its 25-point program to the public for the first time. This event marked the effective founding of what would become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, the Nazi Party. The program combined nationalist fervor with pseudo-socialist economic proposals, anti-Semitic rhetoric, with promises to restore German honor. It found fertile ground in Bavaria, where resentment over the Treaty of Versailles ran particularly deep. The presentation thrust the fledgling party into the public spotlight, and membership began to grow steadily throughout 1920 and into 1921. In the spring of 1920, Röhm began attending meetings of a group called Eiserne Faust, Iron Fist, which gathered in the apartment of Captain Pfeffer von Salomon. This organization brought together nationalist military officers who harbored revolutionary ambitions, men who wanted to overturn the Weimar Republic and replace it with an authoritarian government that would repudiate Versailles and restore German military power. It was at one of these Iron Fist meetings that Röhm first encountered Adolf Hitler. At the time, Hitler held a relatively minor position as a training officer and was only beginning to develop his skills as an orator and political organizer. Yet even in these early interactions, Röhm recognized something compelling in Hitler's vision and personality, a single-minded determination and an ability to articulate the rage and humiliation that so many veterans felt. Röhm also met Captain Karl Mayer during this period, another figure who would play a significant role in the early Nazi movement. These connections drew Röhm deeper into Munich's radical right-wing political circles, creating a network of relationships that would eventually place him at the center of the Nazi Party's paramilitary apparatus. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, had imposed crushing terms on defeated Germany. Beyond the loss of territory and the imposition of massive reparations payments, the treaty severely restricted German military capabilities. The victorious Allies intended to ensure that Germany could never again threaten the peace of Europe. The treaty limited the German army to just 100,000 men, a force suitable only for internal policing, not for fighting a major war. The navy was similarly restricted, and Germany was forbidden from possessing military aircraft or tanks. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland bordering France, was to remain permanently demilitarized, creating a buffer zone that left Germany's western regions defenseless against potential French invasion. The Weimar Republic, desperate to avoid further Allied sanctions, began implementing these disarmament provisions. On August 7, 1920, the government enacted the Law for the Disarmament of the Population, which imposed severe penalties up to 5 years, imprisonment on anyone who knowingly concealed information about hidden weapons, caches for men like Röhm, who had devoted his entire adult life to Germany's military strength. These measures felt like a continuation of the battlefield defeat, an ongoing humiliation that seemed designed to permanently reduce Germany to second-class status among nations. The bitterness intensified on January 21, 1921, when the German army received orders to reduce its strength further from 200,000 to the treaty-mandated 100,000. Officers who had hoped the German government might resist this final capitulation found their anger reaching a boiling point when the order came on July 29, 1921, to destroy the ordnance depots at Bamberg, Munich, and Ingolstadt. It struck at the heart of Bavaria's military infrastructure. These facilities contained not merely weapons, but also the means to train soldiers and maintain military readiness, the essential foundations of any future revival of German military power. On July 31, 1921, Adolf Hitler was elected chairman of the newly renamed National Socialist German Workers' Party. The name change itself was significant. The addition of National Socialist was intended to appeal simultaneously to nationalist sentiment and to working-class Germans who might otherwise be drawn to socialism or communism. Hitler's election as chairman marked his complete takeover of what had begun as someone else's political organization. Röhm, already an ally and friend of Hitler by this point, became intrigued by the party's paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, known colloquially as the Stormtroopers or Brown Shirts, after the color of their uniforms. When Captain Heiss invited Röhm to establish a Reichsflagge, national flag unit in Munich, Röhm initially hesitated. He was already deeply involved in Freikorps activities and other nationalist organizing efforts. Eventually, however, he accepted the invitation and characteristically threw himself into recruitment with ferocious energy. Commenting on the frenzy of activity surrounding these various nationalist movements, Röhm displayed the practical, unsentimental mindset that would characterize his approach to politics throughout his life. Flaming protests and mass demonstrations are certainly valuable for whipping up sentiment, he observed, and are perhaps often indispensable. But if there is no man to make the practical preparations behind the smokescreen and then act, they will be without effect. Röhm believed that emotional rallies and passionate speeches had their place, but ultimately, political change required organization, discipline, and, when the moment arrived, the willingness to use force. This conviction separated him from many of the intellectuals and ideologues in the Nazi movement. Röhm was fundamentally a man of action, impatient with abstract theorizing, focused always on the practical question: how do we actually seize power? He became increasingly convinced that an ultimate violent confrontation was inevitable, a climactic clash between the nationalist militias and what he called the internationalist and anti-fatherland allied and parliamentary-dominated government forces. In his judgment, there would be no resolution through peaceful means or gradual political change. The Weimar Republic would not voluntarily relinquish power to nationalists. Only through force could Germany be redeemed. In 1922, a merger occurred between the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, and the Independent Social Democratic Party, USPD, two left-wing parties that had been divided since 1917. This consolidation strengthened the left's political position and was widely interpreted by nationalist groups as an admission that the democratic left felt threatened by the steady growth of Völkisch ethno-nationalist movements. The merger suggested anxiety about the rising tide of right-wing nationalism that was particularly strong in Bavaria. On October 8, 1922, Bavaria's political landscape shifted dramatically when the state replaced Minister-President Graf Lärchenfeld with Eugen von Knilling, a politician with strong pro-nationalist sympathies. This change reflected Bavaria's growing divergence from the more centrist politics of the national government in Berlin. Hitler's Nazi Party was successfully gaining traction, and the success of Benito Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy, where Mussolini had been appointed prime minister on October 31, 1922, greatly emboldened German nationalists. The Vienna newspaper Neue Freie Presse captured this momentum in an article published on December 14, 1922. The paper noted that Hitler, who had once been an outsider not really taken seriously, had become the strongest power in South German nationalism. This observation proved prescient. Within a year, Hitler would attempt to translate his growing political support into actual seizure of power. In an effort to curb the nationalist fervor sweeping Bavaria, the German government in Berlin took a provocative step. They placed the Bavarian Reichswehr, the official army unit stationed in Bavaria, under the direct control of the National Army Command in Berlin, subordinating them to the Reich president and severing them almost completely from Bavarian state control. Röhm viewed this maneuver as a constitutional coup, an attempt by the social, democratic-dominated national government to strip Bavaria of its military autonomy and assert Berlin's dominance over the regional government. The move reflected the deep tensions within the Weimar Republic's federal structure, where regional states like Bavaria maintained substantial autonomy and often pursued policies at odds with the national government. The struggle between nationalists and Republicans increasingly played out through bureaucratic and legal channels, though violence always simmered beneath the surface. According to a memorandum from Colonel Ritter von Bonin, leader of the Bavarian Freikorps, a Bavarian government official named Deputy Erhard Auer had launched a series of personal attacks against Captain Röhm and his colleagues, which were to some extent fictitious. In reality, Auer's accusations were substantially accurate. He charged Röhm with weapon smuggling, racketeering, political violence, involvement in murder, and harboring ambitions to impose a military dictatorship that would unite Germany and Austria under authoritarian rule. These were not wild fabrications. Röhm was indeed involved in most of these activities, either directly or through his organizational networks. The increasing pressure from Auer's accusations, combined with the earlier order subordinating Bavarian military units to Berlin's control, led to a significant setback for Röhm's career. He was transferred and demoted from his position as General Staff of Infantry Leader 7 to a lower position with the 7th Division General Staff. For an ambitious officer like Röhm, this represented a serious blow to his standing and influence. Röhm understood perfectly well that this transfer was politically motivated, a move by the social, democratic-controlled national government to weaken nationalist influence within Bavaria's military structure. Colonel von Bohnen refused to accept the replacement officer that Berlin attempted to impose, recognizing the transfer for what it was, an effort to gain control of Bavaria's weapon stockpiles by removing officers like Röhm who would actively resist disarmament policies. The Social Democrats had been planning this campaign for years, ever since the introduction of the disarmament laws. Having failed to convince officers guarding weapons depots to voluntarily hand over their stocks, the government now sought to weaken their resolve by purging nationalist officers and replacing them with more compliant personnel. Röhm would later describe 1923 as a distressing year, a period marked by his separation from Colonel von Bohnen and the Freikorps units where he had built his reputation. Worse still, he faced multiple criminal charges, though ultimately none resulted in conviction. Nevertheless, the experience of having to defend himself against what he called salvos of abuse left him bitter about the Weimar Republic's judicial system. Like most Nazi Party members, Röhm viewed law and justice as flexible concepts, secondary to questions of raw power. His willingness to defend himself in court did not represent any genuine respect for legal process. Rather, it was a tactical necessity, a temporary concession to a system he hoped eventually to destroy. Meanwhile, Germany's international situation continued to deteriorate. Unable to meet the massive reparations payments demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany defaulted on its obligations. In response, on January 11, 1923, French and Belgian forces occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. This occupation was intended to allow France and Belgium to seize German coal and manufactured goods as payment in kind. For the reparations, Germany could not pay in currency. The occupation of the Ruhr provoked outrage throughout Germany. The Reichstag passed a resolution on January 23, 1923. Issuing a solemn protest against the occupation of the Ruhr by armed force in breach of international law and treaties. The resolution proclaimed that the Reichstag would support the government in any measure of purposeful resistance to the abuse of force by any means. Munich's reaction was far more extreme. Many in Bavaria condemned what they saw as French imperialism and incompetent leadership in Berlin that had allowed this humiliation to occur. The Nazi Party seized on this crisis to plan a two-day rally in Munich, originally scheduled for January 27th and 28th. 1923, rumors immediately circulated that Hitler planned to use this rally as a springboard for a coup attempt. The Bavarian government, alarmed by rumors of a possible putsch, imposed strict regulations on the planned Nazi rally. Hitler reacted with fury, demanding the right to hold the rally outdoors to maximize attendance and create the grandest possible spectacle. His threats to use force if the rally was prohibited led Bavaria to declare a state of emergency. Yet Hitler found unexpected support from within the Reichswehr itself. Military troops increasingly sympathized with the Nazi movement, creating profound unease within the Bavarian government. Soldiers who were supposed to defend the state against insurrection were instead gravitating toward the very movement that threatened to overthrow it. Faced with this alarming development, and with Hitler providing assurances that he sought only a peaceful demonstration, Officials eventually approved the rally. Many nationalists, including Röhm, viewed the government's response to this episode as revealing a troubling double standard. When foreign powers like France and Belgium violated German sovereignty, the government's response seemed mild and accommodative. But when domestic nationalist groups like Hitler's SA gathered for rallies, the state declared emergencies and mobilized its forces. This apparent disparity fueled nationalist resentment and reinforced the sense that the Weimar government viewed patriotic Germans as more dangerous than foreign occupiers. Of course, this narrative conveniently ignored the reality that Hitler's brown shirts were indeed routinely bullying targets in the streets, invading rival political parties' gatherings, and using systematic intimidation and violence to advance Nazi political goals. Hitler's protestations that the SA was merely a defensive organization protecting Nazi events from communist agitators fooled few observers who paid genuine attention. But Hitler's denials served a purpose. They allowed middle-class Germans who might be sympathetic to nationalist goals to rationalize their support for a movement that was, in reality, fundamentally committed to political violence. On January 23, 1923, the same day the Reichstag passed its toothless resolution protesting the Ruhr occupation, Röhm received an appointment that would prove significant for his future trajectory. He was named to the policy staff of the Reichsflagge, the nationalist unit he had helped organize. This position empowered him to make political decisions, not merely military or organizational ones. Röhm immediately began working closely with Hitler to quietly consolidate Bavaria's various right-wing nationalist militias into a unified alliance. They created what they called the Kampfbund, the Battle League, designed to support the Nazi Party's eventual seizure of power. Initially formed as only a loose confederation of like-minded groups, the Kampfbund gradually developed greater organizational coherence under Röhm's guidance. By spring of 1923, however, Röhm found himself under increasing pressure to reduce his visible involvement with the Kampfbund. His activities and the group's military-style exercises were attracting unwanted attention from both Bavarian authorities and foreign observers. German officials worried that these paramilitary activities would provide welcome material to the French, who were already occupying the Ruhr and would happily use evidence of militarism to justify even harsher measures against Germany. Under this pressure, Röhm resigned his formal leadership role with the Reichsflagge and distanced himself from the Kampfbund Policy Committee. But his withdrawal was tactical rather than genuine. Behind the scenes, he remained deeply involved in nationalist organizing efforts. By early summer of 1923, tensions between the nationalist right and the socialist left reached a breaking point. The Kampfbund Policy Committee presented the Bavarian government with a declaration attempting to prevent socialist and communist militias from holding a May Day parade. The nationalists claimed that a Soviet-style armed demonstration would be an affront to the people and a grim reminder of Bavaria's Red Revolution of 1918. The Kampfbund hoped this declaration would force the Bavarian government to declare a state of emergency that would cancel all political activities, effectively suppressing the left while allowing nationalist groups to maintain their organizational networks. Instead, the Bavarian government hesitated, unwilling to provoke either side decisively. Unverified reports spread that communists were arming themselves in preparation for the May Day demonstrations. Though these reports later proved false, they provided the justification the nationalists needed. The Kampfbund called an emergency meeting to consolidate their forces and mobilize for action. On the morning of May the 1st, the Kampfbund established their battle line at the Oberwiesenfeld, while May Day demonstrators gathered at the Theresienwiese. The city braced for violence. Röhm was asked to mediate between the two groups, but mindful of government scrutiny of his earlier involvement with the Kampfbund, he refused the role. Bavarian government officials, however, didn't believe Röhm's denials of involvement for a moment. They were convinced, correctly, that he remained a central figure in the nationalist movement despite his formal resignations. Röhm discovered during this period that his telephone had been tapped, confirming that authorities were actively monitoring his activities. Following the May Day standoff, which ended without major violence, Röhm was officially relieved of his military post and offered a new position as company commander in Bayreuth. He resigned from this commission the very same day he received it, a symbolic gesture of defiance. Administrative procedures prevented immediate acceptance of his resignation, giving Röhm time to quietly continue his work, planning for the Nazi Party's objectives. By July 1923, Germany's international situation had deteriorated further. France was demanding complete German submission, while Poland and Czechoslovakia also snapped at Germany's heels, sensing weakness. Röhm used this moment of heightened nationalist fury to return to active leadership of the Reichsflagge, leading them in a massive rally held July 25th and 26th. The rally served multiple purposes. It demonstrated nationalist strength, provided military-style training under the guise of a political gathering, and further consolidated the various Völkisch groups under unified leadership. Though Röhm privately doubted the Kampfbund's actual military strength, unity, and readiness for an armed uprising, he recognized the urgency of the political moment. If the nationalists failed to act while the German population seethed with anger over the Ruhr occupation and economic collapse, the opportunity might pass. Worse, the Reichswehr and state police, if not won over to the nationalist cause, would inevitably be used as weapons against the right-wing movements. Only organized, disciplined action could prevent this outcome. Following an impassioned speech to the Kampfbund leadership, Hitler secured unanimous agreement for his complete political authority over the nationalist movement. Röhm described it as a highly emotional moment, the point at which Bavaria's fractious right-wing groups finally united under a single leader. In this context of unified nationalist fervor, Röhm submitted his second formal resignation to the army, this time cutting his ties completely to the official military structure. He was now fully committed to the Nazi Party and its revolutionary ambitions. Throughout October 1923, tensions within Bavaria escalated to a fever pitch. The Nazi Party's attempts to suppress opposition through intimidation left Hitler in what observers described as a fighting mood. Yet, Röhm, always the more calculating tactician, counseled patience. He understood that premature action without adequate preparation would doom any insurrection to failure. Hitler issued a sweeping order, prohibiting NSDAP members from joining any military formations not affiliated with the Kampfbund, an attempt to ensure that nationalist energies flowed exclusively through organizations under his control. The Bavarian government responded by forcing the Reichsflagge to disband entirely. Defiant as ever, Röhm simply reformed the group under a new name, Reichskriegsflagge, or Reich War Flag, RKF. If the authorities wanted to play bureaucratic games, Röhm would match them maneuver for maneuver. Another escalation occurred when the Republic of Thuringia declared a Marxist government in Saxony, inflaming anti-communist sentiment throughout southern Germany. This development, combined with Germany's spiraling hyperinflation, which had reached truly apocalyptic levels by autumn 1923, created what many nationalists saw as a revolutionary moment. Money had become essentially worthless. A wheelbarrow full of currency couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Middle-class savings evaporated overnight. The social order seemed to be collapsing. In this atmosphere of crisis, Hitler and the Kampfbund leadership concluded that the time had come to strike. Their target was a meeting scheduled for November 8, 1923 at the Bürgerbräukeller, one of Munich's largest beer halls. Gustav von Kahr, Bavaria's state commissioner, was scheduled to address nearly 3,000 government officials and civic leaders. It would be an ideal opportunity to seize Bavaria's leadership in a single bold stroke. The evening of November 8th unfolded with theatrical drama. Hitler and his paramilitary forces surrounded the Bürgerbräukeller while von Kahr spoke inside. At 8:45 p.m., Hitler burst into the hall, leaped onto a chair, and fired a pistol shot into the ceiling. In the stunned silence that followed, he proclaimed the dissolution of the existing government and announced the establishment of a new nationalist regime. Within the hour, Hitler had announced the composition of both a new Bavarian government and a provisional German nationalist government. Von Kahr and other Bavarian officials were placed under protective custody, effectively held prisoner, while the putschists attempted to consolidate their seizure of power. Röhm received a critical assignment: secure the War Ministry building. When he arrived with his Reichskriegsflagge troops, the soldiers guarding the ministry refused his demand that they recognize the new government and surrender the facility. Röhm responded with characteristic decisiveness. He seized the building by force. Hitler arrived at the War Ministry around 11 p.m. to congratulate Röhm on this early success. Yet despite the apparent progress, an atmosphere of profound unease pervaded the building. The putsch depended entirely on the Reichswehr and state police either joining the revolution or remaining neutral. If government forces actively opposed the takeover, the poorly armed Kampfbund unit stood no chance in a sustained fight. Röhm soon received disturbing reports. Reichswehr troops and state police were mobilizing to retake the War Ministry and crush the putsch. He prepared his officers to defend their position, but gave them strict orders not to fire upon Reichswehr soldiers. The Reichswehr is nationalist, Röhm insisted, and sooner or later will stand shoulder to shoulder with us in the struggle for Germany's liberation. This instruction revealed both Röhm's genuine belief in the righteousness of the nationalist cause and his catastrophic miscalculation. The Reichswehr, whatever its officers' private political sympathies, would follow orders from the legitimate government. Röhm's faith in shared nationalist sentiment blinded him to the power of institutional discipline and legal authority. After lengthy negotiations throughout the night, surrender terms arrived at dawn on November 9th. The Reichskriegsflagge would be permitted to honorably lower their flag, surrender all weapons to state police, and turn Röhm over to state custody. Lacking any viable alternative, Röhm accepted these conditions. Meanwhile, Hitler had left the War Ministry to lead a march through Munich's streets, hoping that a show of popular support would rally the Reichswehr to the nationalist cause or at least intimidate the government into capitulation. Instead, state police blocked the marchers' path. Shots rang out. Historians still debate who fired first, and in the ensuing chaos, Hitler was pulled to the ground so violently that he dislocated his shoulder. 16 putschists and 4 police officers died in the brief exchange of gunfire. Hitler was spirited away before he could be captured. Röhm, already in custody at the War Ministry, was transported on November 12th to Neudeck prison for his first hearing. 2 days later, authorities transferred him to Stadelheim prison to await trial alongside Hitler and the other putsch leaders. The Beer Hall Putsch had failed utterly. In purely military terms, it had been a fiasco from start to finish. Yet politically, its consequences would prove far more complex than anyone anticipated at the time. While imprisoned awaiting trial, Röhm composed a pamphlet titled Savior of the Fatherland, a polemical piece designed to counter Gustav von Kahr's narrative of events. Where von Kahr presented himself as having saved Bavaria from a dangerous insurrection, Röhm portrayed Hitler as the true defender of German honor, acting to protect the Reich, while von Kahr played the role of suppressor and betrayer of nationalist aspirations. The pamphlet articulated Röhm's broader worldview with stark clarity. The November Revolution of 1918 had ruined Germany, he argued. The forced acceptance of war guilt under Versailles had crippled the nation politically and economically. Germany had been robbed of Upper Silesia, the Rhineland, and the Ruhr without any meaningful attempt to retain these territories. The government's ongoing policy of international appeasement was starving the German people while enriching foreign powers. On February 26, 1924, Röhm, Hitler, and the other putsch conspirators finally stood trial. The The proceedings became a national sensation, with newspapers throughout Germany reporting on Hitler's speeches from the defendant's dock. Rather than simply defending his actions, Hitler used the trial as a platform to broadcast his political philosophy to the entire nation. All defendants were convicted, but the sentences varied dramatically. Hitler received 5 years imprisonment, of which he would serve less than 9 months, giving him time to write his political manifesto, Mein Kampf. Röhm, however, was one of the few defendants given a conditional discharge, meaning he served virtually no jail time. This lenient treatment reflected the court's assessment that while Röhm had participated in the putsch, he had not been among its primary architects. More significantly, it demonstrated the profound sympathy many in Bavaria's judicial system felt toward the nationalist cause. The judges, drawn from conservative legal circles, viewed the putschists more as misguided patriots than as dangerous criminals. During Hitler's imprisonment, the responsibility for maintaining the Nazi movement fell largely to Röhm. Hitler specifically requested that Röhm begin rebuilding the Kampfbund forces, a task made more difficult by State Commissioner von Kahr's prohibition on such paramilitary organizing. The Reichstag elections of May 4, 1924, brought stunning results for the nationalist cause. The National Socialist Freedom Party, effectively the Nazi Party, operating under a different name to evade legal restrictions, won 32 seats. Röhm himself claimed one of these seats, giving him parliamentary immunity and a national platform. As a member of the Reichstag, Röhm sponsored legislation relating to soldiers' rights, treatment of prisoners of war, and intervention on behalf of nationalist fighters imprisoned in French jails. None of these bills reached the floor for debate, as the majority coalition simply refused to consider them. This experience confirmed Röhm's contempt for parliamentary democracy. In his view, parliaments were inherently dysfunctional, incapable of addressing Germany's fundamental problems. Meanwhile, the Bavarian government proposed creating a not ban, an emergency force that would absorb all paramilitary groups under direct government control. Röhm viewed this as yet another attempt to neutralize nationalist military strength, and prohibited former Kampfbund members from joining the not ban. In September 1924, Röhm met with Captain Hermann Göring, then in exile in Innsbruck, Austria, to plan a major conference for SA leaders scheduled for May 17th and 18th, 1924. Shortly thereafter, Röhm founded the Front League to consolidate the various nationalist fighting forces within Germany under unified leadership. Hitler's release from Landsberg prison in December 1924 should have marked a triumphant reunion between the two men who had been so central to building the Nazi movement. Instead, it precipitated a serious rupture in their relationship. Hitler officially refounded the NSDAP in February 1925, despite the party still being legally banned in parts of Germany. He offered Röhm command of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which had been the party's primary paramilitary wing before the failed putsch. But Röhm, displaying the independence that would eventually prove fatal, declined to accept the position unless Hitler agreed to specific conditions. Few of Hitler's subordinates would have dared to impose conditions on their leader. Most viewed Hitler with near religious devotion, accepting his authority as absolute. Röhm, however, described his relationship with Hitler as an honest friendship, implying a relationship between equals rather than leader and follower. Colleagues frequently observed Röhm speaking to Hitler with remarkable informality, even challenging him directly in conversations. On April 26, 1925, Röhm presented Hitler with a memorandum outlining his conditions for accepting SA leadership. He demanded sole command of the Front, which would remain an independent organization within the broader Nazi movement. The Front would be forbidden from involving itself in party political affairs and could not take direct orders from political leaders. Most provocatively, Röhm insisted that the Frontbahn would only accept directives from state authorities and the Reichswehr if deemed necessary for defending the fatherland. These conditions revealed the fundamental orientation of Röhm's political philosophy. He believed in the supremacy of the citizen soldier who could exercise political will through force, independent of civilian political control. The military, in his vision, should be the primary instrument of German nationalism, not subordinate to politicians, but rather the core institution around which political authority should organize itself. Hitler rejected these conditions categorically. He wanted the paramilitary forces merged completely into the NSDAP structure, operating as the party's instrument rather than as an independent power center. The conflict represented two incompatible visions: Röhm's concept of an autonomous military force that would participate in politics on its own terms, versus Hitler's demand for absolute control over all elements of the movement. Unable to reach agreement, Röhm resigned his position entirely. Captain Weiss, a fellow officer, later wrote of him, "Wherever Captain Röhm appeared, there was life, and, above all, practical work was accomplished. He was the real founder of the German Kampfbund and the soul of this creation." Following his resignation, Röhm made a surprising decision. He would leave Germany altogether and accept a position as military advisor to the Bolivian army. This choice reflected not merely disappointment with Hitler's refusal to grant him autonomy, but a deeper frustration with the entire German political situation. Bolivia, locked in a territorial dispute with Paraguay over the Chaco region, was modernizing its military and welcomed European advisors. For Röhm, the position offered good pay, prestige, and escape from the stifling political atmosphere of Weimar Germany. He would spend several years in South America, far removed from the dramatic events unfolding in his homeland. During Röhm's absence, the Nazi Party underwent significant transformation. The Sturmabteilung continued to exist, but became increasingly disorganized and directionless without strong leadership. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler began building up the Schutzstaffel, the SS, as an elite organization within the party that would eventually rival and then overshadow the SA. Yet one aspect of Röhm's personal life that has fascinated historians and contemporaries alike cannot be ignored: his homosexuality. Ernst Röhm lived virtually his entire adult life as an openly gay man, extraordinary in an era when homosexuality was not merely socially stigmatized, but criminally prosecuted in Germany. How did Röhm reconcile his sexual orientation with his membership in a movement that espoused hypermasculine, traditionalist values? Some biographers have speculated that his militaristic bearing and aggressive leadership style represented compensation, an attempt to counterbalance society's view of gay men as inherently effeminate. His fellow officers noted the seeming contradiction. Here was a man who embodied martial virtue and courage, who had been wounded repeatedly in combat, yet who openly maintained relationships with other men. Röhm's sexuality would later be weaponized by his enemies within the Nazi Party, particularly Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, both of whom despised him. They viewed his openness about his homosexuality and his tolerance of it among SA leadership as both morally repugnant and politically dangerous. Hitler himself had always known of Röhm's sexual orientation and appeared genuinely indifferent to it, viewing Röhm's organizational abilities and loyalty as far more important than his private life. In 1930, following the Stenners Revolt, an attempted splitting of the Nazi Party by disaffected members, Hitler recalled Röhm from Bolivia to take command of the SA. The terms Hitler now offered were considerably more lenient than those Röhm had rejected in 1925. Röhm accepted and returned to find the SA in shambles, a disorganized collection of street brawlers lacking discipline, structure, or strategic purpose. Röhm immediately set about transforming the organization. He established Gruppen, regional groupings encompassing multiple localities, each commanded by an SA Gruppenführer who answered directly to Hitler and Röhm. Under this new structure, the SA expanded explosively, eventually growing to rival the Reichswehr in size. At its peak, the SA would be nearly 20 times larger than Germany's official military. The SA's primary activities involved street violence, brawling with communists, intimidating political opponents, attacking Jews, and creating an atmosphere of constant crisis that the Nazis could exploit politically. The brown shirts became notorious for their brutality, their willingness to beat strikebreakers during labor disputes, and their role in disrupting opposition political meetings. Yet even as the SA grew more powerful, internal tensions developed. The Schutzstaffel, under Himmler's leadership, had taken over the crucial role of protecting top Nazi officials. The SS cultivated an image as an elite force of fanatical Hitler loyalists, distinguished from the supposedly crude and undisciplined SA street fighters. This rivalry would have fatal consequences for Röhm. When the Nazis assumed power in January 1933, Röhm occupied a position of immense influence. He was appointed minister without portfolio in the new government and named Reichsleiter, the second highest political rank in the Nazi party after Hitler himself. Röhm immediately attempted a bold political maneuver, merging the SA into the Reichswehr, creating a unified German military force under his command. This proposal profoundly threatened Hitler, who interpreted it as a potential prelude to a military coup. It also alarmed the entire existing military establishment, whose officers were deeply insecure about Röhm's popularity with the SA rank and file. Röhm's vision was to transform the Reichswehr into a training organization for the SA, effectively making the professional military subordinate to the Nazi paramilitary force. He tried to compromise, suggesting that only select SA members would be integrated into the Reichswehr, but the proposal was rejected outright by military leadership and by Hitler himself. Many SA members felt betrayed during this period. They had fought street battles for years to bring the Nazis to power, yet once the party controlled the government, little changed for them materially. The SA drew primarily from working-class backgrounds, men who had expected the socialist element of National Socialism to deliver economic benefits. Instead, they watched as middle-class party members and the SS received preferential treatment. The rivalry between SA and SS intensified dangerously. The SA had initially created some of the first concentration camps for political prisoners, but Himmler and Göring quickly established their own camps to compete. By 1933, Himmler had successfully maneuvered to gain control of even the SA's concentration camps, replacing their staff with SS Totenkopf, Death's Head, units. Hitler held both fear and contempt for the power the SA wielded under Röhm's command. He wished to reduce SA numbers significantly, but Röhm resisted fiercely. Instead of accepting cuts, Röhm continued expanding the organization, fueling speculation about a possible SA coup. Hitler initially resisted moving directly against Röhm. Their friendship ran deep, and Röhm remained one of the few Nazi officials permitted to address Hitler by his first name, rather than as Mein Führer. But several factors converged to seal Röhm's fate. First, President Paul von Hindenburg, Germany's aging head of state, was dying. Hitler needed the military's support to consolidate all power in his own hands after Hindenburg's death. The army made clear that their support was conditional on reducing Röhm's influence and refocusing on rebuilding the traditional Reichswehr and Kriegsmarine rather than empowering the SA's second. A vicious power struggle raged among the Nazi leadership. Himmler, Göring, and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels all fought for control and influence. All three despised Röhm, partly for his open homosexuality, partly for his independent power base, and partly because they saw him as an obstacle to their own ambitions. On April 20, 1934, Göring transferred de facto control of the Gestapo to Himmler. This consolidation of security forces under Himmler's authority was explicitly designed to counteract Röhm's influence and prepare the ground for action against him. In August 1934, Hindenburg finally died. Hitler saw his opportunity to eliminate Röhm and thereby secure the military's complete loyalty. He was also threatened by Hindenburg's warning that if Hitler did not act to contain Röhm, the president would declare martial law and allow the army to take control. In preparation for the purge, documents were fabricated suggesting that Röhm had received French money to orchestrate a coup against the Nazi government. These forged papers were shown to leading SS officers on June 24, 1934, creating the pretext for action. Hitler arranged a meeting of SA leadership at the lakeside resort of Bad Wiessee on June 30, 1934, ostensibly to discuss the SA's future role. Röhm and other senior SA commanders arrived unsuspecting, believing they were attending a routine leadership conference. In the early morning hours of June 30th, Hitler personally led SS and regular police units in storming the Hotel Hanselbauer. We have returned to the scene where our story began. Röhm sleeping peacefully, unaware that his oldest friend had come to murder him. Hitler burst into rooms throughout the hotel, finding several SA leaders in compromising positions, some drunk, others with male companions. These discoveries, whether genuine or staged, served as useful propaganda justification for what followed. Hitler confronted Röhm directly, and the man who had built the SA from nothing hung his head in shame, not at his political activities, but at being caught by Hitler in such circumstances. Röhm and numerous other SA officers were arrested immediately. While many were executed on the spot, Hitler initially spared Röhm. Their personal history, their friendship, gave Hitler pause. Back in Berlin, Goebbels issued the code word Kolibri, hummingbird, unleashing execution squads throughout Germany against a broader list of targets. Not just SA leaders, but also old political enemies, inconvenient witnesses and rival conservatives. Hitler made a public spectacle of the purge, claiming the SA leadership had been engaged in treachery and moral degradation that violated Nazi values. Röhm and other SA commanders were accused of plotting a coup and indulging in sexual activities deemed offensive to the party's standards. Most of those arrested on June 30th were executed immediately. Yet Röhm remained alive in his cell at Stadelheim prison, guarded but unharmed. Hitler agonized over the decision. Could he really order the death of the man who had been with him since the earliest days of the movement? The man who had called him Adolf, when all others bowed and scraped? On July 1st, 1934, 2 days after the initial arrests, Hitler finally gave the order. SS officers entered Röhm's cell and placed a pistol on the table before him. They informed him he had 10 minutes to take the honorable way out. If he refused, they would do it for him. Röhm's response captured both his courage and his bitterness. If I am to be killed, let Adolf do it himself. He refused to commit suicide. When the SS officers returned minutes later and found Röhm standing at attention, they raised their pistols and fired. Multiple rounds struck him. Ernst Röhm war hero, organizational genius, and one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, died on the floor of a prison cell, murdered on the orders of the man he had called friend. The Night of the Long Knives claimed between 100 and 200 victims. The exact number remains disputed. Beyond SA leadership, Hitler used the purge to settle old scores. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was murdered along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, who had led a socialist faction within the Nazi Party before being forced out, was hunted down and killed. Conservative figures who had criticized the regime also fell victim. Röhm's death handed Himmler the autonomy he had long sought for the SS. No longer subordinate to any other organization, the SS would grow into the primary instrument of Nazi terror. running at the concentration camps, conducting the Holocaust and eventually fielding its own military divisions. Goering, too, benefited enormously. His rival for influence had been eliminated. In the aftermath, he worked to erase Röhm from the Nazi Party's official history. Most dramatically, the Nazis destroyed all known copies of Victory of Faith, the propaganda film from the 1933 Nuremberg rally in which Röhm had appeared prominently. The regime attempted to make Röhm an unperson, his contributions forgotten, his very existence denied. Ernst Röhm's life was shaped fundamentally by war and political chaos. The Germany of his youth had been consumed by imperial ambition and nationalist fervor. The catastrophic defeat in World War I and the humiliating terms of Versailles created conditions in which extremist movements could flourish. The Weimar Republic's inability to form stable governments or address the people's material needs created the opening that figures like Röhm and Hitler exploited. Ruthlessly, Röhm was instrumental in Hitler's rise to power. Without Röhm's organizational genius, the SA would never have become the force that intimidated opponents and created the atmosphere of crisis the Nazis needed. Without the SA's street violence and voter intimidation, the Nazis would not have achieved electoral success in the early 1930s. Röhm also played a darker role in German history. The SA's street violence normalized political brutality. The concentration camps that Röhm's organization established in 1933 created the infrastructure that the SS would later perfect into instruments of genocide. Though Röhm died before the Holocaust, his organizational work laid groundwork for Nazi terror. Yet Röhm also represented a threat to Hitler's consolidating power, a reminder that the Nazi movement contained competing factions with different visions for Germany's future. Röhm genuinely believed in a kind of soldier's socialism, where the SA's working-class fighters would be rewarded with status and material benefits. Hitler never shared this vision and was willing to sacrifice millions of SA members to secure military support and consolidate his personal dictatorship. In the end, Ernst Röhm's fate illustrates the essential cannibalistic nature of totalitarian movements. The revolution devours its children. The man who had helped build the Nazi machine was destroyed by it when he became inconvenient. His murder demonstrated that in Hitler's Germany, no one was safe, not even those who had been with the Führer from the beginning, not even those who could call him friend. The question posed at the beginning remains: was Ernst Röhm merely a brutal thug seeking power through force, or was he a calculating schemer who might have replaced Hitler given the chance? The truth likely contains elements of both and neither. Röhm was a soldier who found purpose in violence, an organizer who genuinely believed in military discipline as the foundation for political order, and a revolutionary who thought force could redeem Germany's honor. He was also a man of contradictions, a homosexual in a homophobic movement, a socialist in a party increasingly dominated by big business interests, a military man who died on the orders of a former corporal. His story remains a dark mirror held up to the chaos of interwar Germany, a reminder of how catastrophic defeat, economic collapse, and political extremism can combine to produce movements that ultimately consume even their most devoted servants. The Hotel Hanselbauer, where Röhm was arrested, no longer stands. Stadelheim prison, where he died, still operates today, though the cell where he spent his final hours has long since been repurposed. Ernst Röhm left no descendants, no monuments, no institutions bearing his name. The Nazi Party worked to erase him from memory. Yet his legacy endures in the historical record as a warning that loyalty to tyrants earns no security, that revolutionary movements betray their founders, and that political violence, once unleashed, recognizes no limit, not even the bonds of friendship forged in war.